Welcome, everyone. I'm Samira Ahmed. I'm an alumna, actually, of Edmund Hall, Oxford, rather than Jesus College. But they didn't know this when they asked me to chair this. My nephew, I'm now going to embarrass, who's called Yamir Bare, is in his second year at Jesus doing classics. So I don't think he's here. I checked, he's not one of the participants. But if you know him, you can embarrass him by telling him I told you all. I was delighted to be asked to chair this discussion. And in a way, you know why we're having this discussion. There is an absolute, and I think it's fair to say there is a kind of revolution going on in this country and across the world about how we have not dealt with enduring issues about racism, particularly about the legacy of slavery, and how entwined they are in the way that our institutions are run and the experiences of people of colour in particular as they navigate their lives in the societies in which they've been born and raised. I read English literature at Teddy Hall in 1986 to 89, so a long time ago. But I remember it being one of the most important and valuable times of my life. I also remember from my own personal experience, I felt I encountered less discrimination in my academic life as a student there than I did in the world of work. It was quite a shock, actually, finding what the world of work was like in comparison. The plan for today is we have four really interesting people, all with experience in teaching as former students, as academics, to debate a lot of these issues around education, around society, and around the concerns that we have. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly and say a few words about their kind of general feelings and where they're coming from in taking part in this. We'll then have discussion for about an hour around kind of four key issues about the role of education in tackling societal change, about white privilege and its meaning in the context of fighting racism, what needs to happen to bring about racial equality, including issues around decolonising education syllabuses, and personal testimonies as well. And we want to allow half an hour for questions from those of you. And I know that there are people who might have teaching backgrounds, student backgrounds, all kinds of connections that are important to the health of a great university college like Jesus College. There is a way that you could submit questions in advance, and then I'll call on you to ask them yourselves if you want. So if you've got a pen or you want to type this in, tinyurl.com/JC June Forum, all lowercase. So tinyurl.com/JC June Forum. So you can submit questions and thoughts through there, say your name, where you're from, and then later on I'll call on you and ask you to ask your question yourself if you want. And just to be aware that this is the first in what's planned to be a series of talks and debates around kind of big issues that are important. And the details will be on the website, which is jesus.ox.ac.uk. That's jesus.ox.ac.uk. But I'll just give you the forum for submitting questions again. tinyurl.com/JC June Forum, all one word. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers, and anyone who's just joining as well, could you all turn your cameras off, please, so that you can see us, but we're not putting too much video demand on this for now. And if you could all have your mics on mute for now, it also helps reduce the ambient noise. So thank you very much. So cameras off, if that's okay. I'd like to ask Patricia Daly, who's the Vice President of Jesus College and a Professor of Geography first, to tell us a bit about herself and her thoughts. Welcome.
Thank you, Samira. My name is Patricia Daly. I am a professor in the Human Geography of Africa at the University of Oxford. I'm also the Vice Principal of Jesus College. I am Jamaican by birth, British by nationality. I'm part of the Windrush generation in the sense that I came to Britain in 1968 at the age of 10. So most of my, I did 1 year of primary school in Britain, but the rest of my education has been in here as well. My journey, I suppose, my academic journey, and began perhaps out of my experience in British schools. I wasn't as a secondary school student. Initially, I wasn't encouraged, but I was really fortunate, perhaps in the latter part of when I was doing my O-levels at the time, to have some wonderful teachers who encouraged me. In fact, I've only recently got back in touch with my French teacher who still lives in the same house in Stoke Newington. And she encouraged me enormously to think about going to university and later on to think about a professional career. So I'm really indebted to the teachers I encountered. I already knew from my school that it was possible to be a teacher as a Black person in Britain because my chemistry teacher was Black. Since I joined Oxford in 1991, I was the first Black person to be appointed as a lecturer in the university. And there are now, I think, about 9 of us, 3 Black full professors and only 2 Black women and the other Black woman is an associate professor. Since arriving in Oxford, I have strived to promote equality and diversity within the university. I suppose, like most Black academics in universities, I do a lot of equality labor. I've sat on equality and diversity committees, on harassment committees, and I've worked with students, mentored them, and in whatever capacity I can, try to address some of the systemic racism that is in the university. At present, I'm very active in the campaign to change the university. I've supported the Rhodes Must Fall movement. I wrote a chapter in an edited volume that the students produced, and I am very keen to bring about change. I'll just say something about my subject and then finish. Geography is very much a colonial...
You were joining this meeting. Could you turn your cameras off, please, as well as having your settings on mute? It just helps keep the quality of the video high. So just if you're watching for now, could you just turn your videos off? Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Patricia.
Yeah, I just want to say geography is very much a white-dominated subject. Certainly in the UK, there are very few Black geographers. The number is growing, and I think partly that is because geography was a discipline. The founding of geography was really to support empire and colonialism. Geography was established to teach young men in particular who joined the colonial civil service. So, and geography has had to work hard to try and change its image, and there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, I still feel considerable anxiety when I go into the building of the Royal Geographical Society, which is the professional, body of my discipline. I also work I work on Africa. I'm a political geographer working on African politics, and African studies itself is also very much white dominated. And I think many Africanists in the UK in particular have difficulty recognizing that an African from the diaspora can actually produce legitimate knowledge about African and about Africa.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll stop there and then I'll say my piece.
I think it's important for you to set out where you are. So just for those who are just joining, I'm going to pick out Jill Manley and Rishi Patel because, hi, could you guys turn your cameras off, please? If you click on the camera icon, Jill, you should be able to it just helps me. We can just see those who are speaking. Thank you so much. So anyone who isn't speaking, just cameras off and audio off as well. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. So I'd like to call next on Claire Williams, who's an alumna of Oxford University and works at a charity in Oxford. Do introduce yourself and tell us a bit about where you're coming from.
Thanks, Samira. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Williams, and I was at Oxford University from 2005 to 2008. I studied English, language and literature, and actually Paulina was one of my tutors. So shout out to Paulina. So I'm Black Caribbean heritage. I've got my St. Lucia Margon show, unashamedly. So my mum is from St. Lucia, my dad is from Jamaica. So I grew up in West London. I went to a school that was one of the first to become an academy, and then I went on to Oxford. I didn't actually know about Oxford really, or kind of like the Oxbridge or anything like that until I was 16, which I think says a lot. So I went to Oxford and then I became an English teacher through Teach First. So that's like a fast track program into teaching. And it's built around some research that was found that made the link between socioeconomic disadvantage and students' outcome. So I did that pathway into teaching. I was an English teacher for 10 years, had various leadership positions. And during that time, I've always worked alongside the university to do access trips for students, let them come to see the university and just become familiar with what's on offer. Because I know that how profound the effect of that was on me, because I didn't know about Oxford until I saw it. And so that for me is just something that I'm committed to doing all the time, and particularly with Jesus College as well. So that's a little bit about me, and I've gone back into postgraduate study now. I'm doing a master's.
Tell us about your PhD, because it's a great topic.
Oh, well, I'm doing a master's at the moment in culture, diaspora and ethnicity. So looking at a range of topics. My first module was on slavery. The module I've just completed was on kind of like art, representations of Black people, Black bodies in art, in both pro and abolitionist art. And the next module I'm doing is around sort of culture and cultures of human rights. So that's going to be starting in the next few weeks. So, yeah, I'm just looking forward to do some more study. I think my experience as a teacher and then doing further academic study will really help me to be part of these conversations.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claire. So a couple of people with their cameras on. I think one of them has actually left. But if your camera is on, is it Catherine Cole? Do you want to put your camera to off? That would be great. Thank you. And Karen with a C, but I think they're not there. So our next speaker is Adrian Clarke, who I know as a secondary school teacher in the wonderful neighbourhood of Tooting, which is South London, where he's careers leader at Ernest Bevan College. Go ahead, Adrian.
Right, yes. Firstly, can I just say, in memory of George Floyd, this is one of the reasons why we're here today, as well as other things, right? And I've been many things. I think before I introduce myself, I want to give a quote, and it's been very much sums up my life experience. And I'll say this, life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. And I think that very much sums up my experience. I was born in London and educated in Barbados. My primary years in Barbados. That was my primary school. I came back to England and educated at an Anglican school in Greenwich. I then went to an inner London secondary school in Deptford, and I left school with some good O levels, and later on I worked as a community worker, and that had a profound influence on my life. I worked for Dame Jocelyn Barrow, was the chairperson. She's a former governor of the BBC.
She died only recently.
That's right.
In the papers, you should go and read about her if you don't know about her.
That's right. An extraordinary woman. And I worked for an organisation called Caribbean House. And we had an organisation called the Centre for Caribbean Studies. My experiences there were tremendous. Just very, very briefly, I was very fortunate. I met James Baldwin, the American civil rights writer. I met C.L.R. James as some of the things that really inspired me. After that, experience of working as a community worker and living in Hackney, working with the Hackney police, and I was very much involved in community work. I then won a place at an affiliated college, Oxford University, called Plato College, where I studied a diploma in social studies around issues around social justice. I then moved on to Durham University, where my undergraduate studies were in politics and history. My thesis was on the civil rights movement. After that, I decided to train as a lawyer. I went on to Sussex University. And when I left university after studying at Sussex, I worked for a number of different legal firms. I worked for large city firms, middle city firms. I also worked with Mike Mansfield's Chambers, Tooks Court. Mike Mansfield was a leading human rights lawyer. And then after that, unfortunately, for various reasons I can go into later on, I didn't become a lawyer. I spent 10 years in publishing. I worked at Choice FM Radio, a black-owned radio station. I even worked at the BBC for a short time and had lots of experience in publishing. I worked for Pride magazine, which these kind of black lifestyle, the Black Marie Claire magazine. For the last 16 years, I've been in education. And in that time, I've worked in different schools. I've been a history teacher, a business studies teacher. I've also taught law as well. And I'm currently a careers leader in a school in Tooting. This whole subject is incredibly important to me, and not just for me, but I think it's something that that we really need to sort of stress. So I would say my experience has been very much a lived experience, and it's not some sort of objective thing. It's very much a sort of a lived experience.
Thank you. Just before I call on our final speaker, Paulina Hughes, can I tell those of you joining the conversation, welcome. Could you turn your video cameras off for now, and also your microphones? And just be aware that we will be calling on people to submit questions at the end of the discussion. There is a place you can go to submit them so that I know who to call on. And it's tinyurl.com/JCJuneForum. So you can submit questions that way. tinyurl.com/JCJuneForum. Paulina Hughes is the final of our panelists. She's a professor of English literature here at Oxford. Hello.
Hi. My name is Paulina Hughes, and I'm originally from Poland. I grew up and was educated in Poland, in Gdansk. That's where Solidarity was born. And I was the first person in Poland to do her master's on Black American women writers. That was in 1988. I was encouraged to do so by a wonderful tutor at the University of Gdansk, who himself had worked on Black American theatre, on contemporary Black theatre. And almost immediately afterwards, I was offered a job at the University of Gdansk teaching English, and went to King's College London for one semester. It was 88. And although it was perfectly understandable that studying Black American women writers in Poland, you would be doing it with white tutors, when I went to King's, it turned out, and it was a wonderful experience, but all the tutors there were white. And I think it's quite extraordinary that at the University of Oxford, where we have the largest English faculty in the world, there is still not a single Black professor. And I'm hugely committed to widening participation in education. I taught, after doing my doctorate at Jesus College in the 90s, and it wasn't on Black American women writers, it was actually on late 17th century English drama. And I now work on early modern literature, politics, and history. So my work is quite interdisciplinary. And I spent 6 years working at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth before coming back to Oxford to a permanent position at Jesus in 2003. And over the past 17 years, I've had 2 Black students, Claire Williams, who is here with us today, and Caitlin, the wonderful Caitlin, who is now in the first year. You could say that this is a terrible record. How many Black candidates do you think I have interviewed during those years? 2, Claire and Caitlin. So it's 100% success rate. So I very much hope that this program and many others will encourage Black pupils to apply to Oxford, to Jesus, and to know that we want you to come here. And we are committed to changing the syllabus and to welcoming you and doing everything in our power to make it possible for you to be an integral part of this university.
Thank you. It's really nice to have a sense of, the experience that each of you bring, because the older you get, the more you remember how things were when we started out. And I was at Oxford 86 to 89 when the women's studies paper had only just been created as an option. And it's funny because one of the papers I did was on African-American women writers, and it felt very exciting. Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou. And they, when you think 30 years ago, how relatively early they were in their writing careers, so there was so much still to come. It was very exciting. Right, I wanted to start, and can I just hope you don't mind me mentioning, for anyone who's joining relatively recently, I think Wend is your username, your camera's on. Would you mind just putting it on to switching the camera off for now? And then later on when we take questions, we'll definitely ask you to turn it back on. It just helps reduce the volume of faces we're seeing for the time being. Thank you so much. And a reminder as we start our discussion, tinyurl.com/JCJuneForum is where you can submit your name and your question, and then I'll call on you later to ask it yourself on the forum. So we wanted to start by talking about the role of education in trying to bring about change. I don't think we need to say to anyone taking part in this discussion, we've all been following news events. We have the sense that everything is connected. What started out as the specifics of the horror and the outrage at the murder of yet another African-American man, George Floyd, has grown to show how interconnected it is to everything to do with how we think about race and how we treat each other in society, and this refusal to acknowledge that there is an unresolved issue at the heart of it. Someone messaged me this morning to point out that in 2013 in this country, the coalition government launched a review of education, and there were plans to put into the history national curriculum specific teaching about Windrush, about post-war immigration, about the Race Relations Act, about legislation around issues such as abortion. So very important issues. That whole paragraph was removed. And the actual plan that went ahead for the national curriculum had a much watered down, vaguer thing about social change. So it's a reminder about how there have been opportunities to change the way we think about education. Maybe if I ask Adrian first, what are your thoughts about what can and should be done in education to try and bring about the change people seem to want now?
I think that education is...
before you start, Adrian, I think you're a bit close to the camera because I can't see your eyes. That would be better. Fantastic.
Okay. Yes. Can you see me now?
Yeah, but if you come in, we can't see you again. Or can you just angle the camera down? I think you're looking down at the camera, aren't you? That's better. Yeah. Where you are is fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm a teacher, so I'm a strong advocate for education. I think that education plays an important role in all aspects of the debate around racism. But let me first say this, is that from my personal experience, having gone to 4 universities, and if you like, being extremely well qualified in an academic sense, right, is no guarantee of my future success. So what we need to understand, we need to look at the puzzle of racism, look at it as a jigsaw. And although education is central in many ways, and I would stand here and say that, the more we learn about each other, then the more we can have greater understanding. And this is central. When I was at school in London, I remember back in the late 70s, people talking about, about race, about immigration, etc., and talking about, the Second World War and things like that, and not being able to argue because I didn't have the tools, I didn't have the knowledge. So it's incredibly important that we empower not just Black people, but everybody. And we see this debate now in this country where people are now interested in literature, in books, in all sorts of things. So education in itself is absolutely crucial. And I'm talking about formal education through school, through university, but more, I think, education of the heart and education of the mind, and all those things need to be stressed. But we must make this clear now. I want to really make this clear now, is that we mustn't think in silos. We mustn't think that if we fix one area, then racism is solved. Racism is part of the whole structure, if you like. The Marxists talk about a superstructure. And that's the way to view it. Because if I were Raheem Sterling, I'll be talking about football racism. If I were a Black actor, I'll be talking about racism in the theatre. If I were a doctor, there's, I think, Carol talking about COVID and NHS and racism, etc., in NHS, etc. So we need to be very, very clear from the beginning. As a key role that education can play, it's not the only solution. And it's rather like if we reform the police, if we reform other sections of society, unless we see society as a whole, from cradle to grave, that's the only way, I think, the best way to approach that. And I'm going
to come on to more, we're going to discuss that, but I do think it's really important that this moment, we want to talk about what could we be doing differently within the education system specifically. I don't know if who wants to come in next, Patricia, Claire, or Paulina, who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. Thanks, Adrian. I agree with a lot of what you were saying there. I think, again, as a teacher, I did teach for 10 years. I guess I've always been in education, just from being a student to now. I think there's a real need for, as I said before, I didn't know that Oxford was an option for me until I saw it. And that was at age 16, when 16/17, when one of my tutors took us in a little bus to Jesus College. Well, to I can't remember which college it was, but we had a trip. And so there is, I think, linked to this idea of systemic racism, or not idea, I think reality, is a culture of low expectations, where why was it up until I was 16 or 17 had nobody ever suggested to me that, you can get into Oxford, these are your options. And then even when I did speak to my teachers about, do you know what, I'd love to go to Oxford, there was some sort of mixed responses about I'd only get in because of positive discrimination, you go to a state school, etc., etc. So if way back down right into secondary schools and lower, there is a culture of low expectations, then how can we ever arrive? And I've just been seeing two bits of research. Simon Burgess and Ellen Greaves, they did a study, test scores and subjective assessment and stereotyping of minorities. They're at Bristol University. This is a 2009 paper, and they found that the assessment of Black students' work was marked down compared to their white counterparts. Another piece of research by Oxford University actually found, this is on the BBC website, that Professor Steve Strand from Oxford University found that Black Caribbean students are twice as likely to be labelled with SEMH, so that's social, emotional, mental health, special needs. So there are implicit biases happening from the time that the students are in the classroom that kind of stick with students and kind of follow them through their life prospects. And so this needs to be dealt with at the classroom level. And it's not about pointing a finger at my white colleagues in the classroom and saying, you're racist. No. It's about looking at implicit biases, looking at trends and saying, look, this is a problem, let's address it. So if students believe that you don't expect much from them, well, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm not saying that students don't have choice, etc., but it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I latched onto that visit I did at Oxford. I went back 7 times in different forms for access, interview training, all sorts of things. I watched a show on TV all about Black ambition. That was to do with Cambridge University. I picked up every article, but that's because I was shown it in the first place. And so maybe moving forward with looking at racism and education, Oxford could be part of doing training with teachers to say, look, you might be teaching in Southeast London, but your students are very much welcome in Oxford and they can get there. So I think that those are my few words.
Thank you. Before we go further, can I just ask Karen and Bill Parker, would you mind turning your cameras off, please? But when we take questions later, we will definitely be asking you to turn them back on. Thank you so much. And if you keep your audio mute. Who wants to go next? Patricia and then Paulina, maybe. So specifically, what can be done in education to tackle, societal change that we need? And we've heard Claire talk about attitudes to some extent from teachers and the expectations that are made. Adrian's talked about the need for something more systemic. I'm quite interested, as both of you teach at university, whether there's I'm a great believer in changing the curriculum myself, and I know we're going to talk about that more specifically. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the role of education here?
And obviously, I think, first of all, if we're going to bring about societal change, one of the things we need to do is to have more Black people in positions of authority in all our institutions, as well as obviously advocating for change in those institutions. And in order to do that, we need to promote social mobility. And there's considerable evidence and theories to support that education enables social mobility. It enables us to acquire various, what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu describes as cultural capital. But the quality of education matters. What it's taught, who teaches it, and how it is taught. We know that in this country, certain people with wealth, with resources, can acquire high quality education easily, and they do so to enable their children to have better life chances than others. Young Black people, young BME young people can, through education, improve their life chances. And it's our right as educators, and it's our duty to ensure that they have access to high quality education, such as institutions such as Oxford. I think that's, and of course, that's really talking about the utility value of education. But as Adrian says, there's an intrinsic value of education. You just have to look at the debate that's going on about statues. People says by taking down statues, you're erasing history. You're rewriting history. But anyone who is the academy will know that we're always rewriting history. We're always changing, what we understand as knowledge, because new ideas come to the fore, new approaches, and so on. Right? We know that there's a saying that history is written by the victor. We know that our archives are problematic. For example, that the British burned a lot of the archives, colonial archives, in order to hide the atrocities that were committed. So the issue is about how do we enable these hidden histories to come to the fore? How do we enable, and actually that's been happening with regards to working class history, women's history. So why not Black history? And we're not erasing, we're asking for a debate. And these debates are very important, as Adrian says, in terms of bringing about, in terms of enables bringing about unity, respect for other communities within our country, and to promote peaceful coexistence.
Thank you. Paulina next. And Karen, do you mind just turning your camera off, please? Thank you. Your video is on. Go ahead, Paulina.
I think we shouldn't see education as somehow separate from society. Education and society are one. Each educational institution, be it a primary school, secondary school, college, they are microcosms of society. They include staff and academics, parents, children. All of them come from different backgrounds. So each institution epitomizes what we are as a society. And I wanted to pick up on what Patricia said about history. I should say that my own work is quite interdisciplinary, and if anyone questions my credentials, I'm actually a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and I publish on history as well as literature. And it seems to me that what is happening here has to be seen in a wider trans-European and global context. And compared to what happens elsewhere. So, for instance, it seems to me that France or Poland have never come to terms with their war past, with their anti-Semitism, with how they acted during the Holocaust. And something similar can be said about Britain, about its colonial past, about its imperial past. And it's not a question about erasing history. As Patricia said, we simply reinterpret history. But if we think of monuments, if we think about toppling this or that statue, why is it happening? It's because not enough is known about the past. And when in 1660 the Royal African Company was founded, it was headed by the Duke of York, the future King James II. Why are we not talking about that? Why don't we talk more widely about the part played both by the monarchy and by the Anglican Church in, for instance, the slave trade? It has to be a wide-ranging conversation. It's bringing things to light rather than suppressing, erasing, and somehow forgetting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. One thing I felt prompted to say when you talked about how you felt France and Poland had not come to terms with some of their history, particularly World War II history. There's an amazing book some of you may know about called Learning from the Germans by Professor Susan Nyman, who's from Mississippi, and she now lives in Berlin. And it's very interesting because the book is partly about what the Germans have done with their Holocaust history. And it's not saying they got everything right at all. And then she focuses very much on what's been going on in America, particularly around commemorating people like Emmett Till and the way that America has chosen not to deal with its legacy, which seems very, very relevant now. Right, we've got about 25 minutes, but I want to open up to questions. I want to move on to the issue of, well, this is the question that's been posed. What does anti-racism in the context of white privilege mean? I wonder if, it's a big subject, but I wonder if you could keep your answers relatively focused so that we could then move on to talk about, or get some responses to each other to it, maybe. I don't know who wants to take it first. I know there will be people who might be taking part in this discussion who still feel they don't quite understand what white privilege means. And I don't want any of you to have to explain it. But bearing that in mind, what are your thoughts about how you tackle it? And I suppose maybe the example I'd give is when you see discussions where people say, but I'm not racist. I don't see colour. Red, green, black, and it always is a list of colours that don't exist in human skin, which for me is that's the thing that I think of as white privilege summed up in an answer. But what are your thoughts about it in anti-racism? Who wants to go first on this?
If I can just say a few words. When I walk, I often go to the United States. And I do research at the Huntington Library in California. It's a very lush area. All the houses are owned by white people or the Chinese, and all the gardeners are Hispanic. There are very few black people around. And when I walk the streets, I do power walking late at night. If I see a police car, I know that I'm safe. Whereas my black family in America, if they were walking late at night on the same street, they wouldn't feel that way. And I think that epitomizes the difference.
Claire, did you want to go next?
Yeah, I think just linking to what Paulina said, it's not having to think about how your skin is going to be interpreted. So, for instance, my sister has a son, a daughter. She's going to have to explain to them one day that when you grow up, you may experience people being discriminated against you because of your skin. White people don't have to do that. They will never have to have that conversation with their children. So even when I was at Oxford, just feeling like if I'm here and I make a mistake, or if an incident happens and I get angry, perhaps maybe what I say will not be listened to, but the trope of the angry black woman will be employed. Rather than listening to what I'm saying and the injustice, the tone or perceived tone of what I'm saying will be taken on board. And so having the weight of all black people on my shoulders when I go into a white majority environment to behave in such a way to say, because if I fail here, it's not because I'm incompetent, it's because I'm black. And on the flip side of that, when I do succeed, it's because of positive discrimination. So that for me would kind of sum up the things that a white person may not have to think about ever. And it's not because, I'm not saying that they're to blame for that, but just being cognizant of the fact that there are conversations, there are situations that a white person will never have to consider because they're white. And so that then becomes a privilege.
Yeah, well, what you said about black anger, when I think about, people being reported automatically because they've had a disagreement with someone, and it just that automatic assumption that and I've seen it happen, I'm afraid, too often, where it's a different standard applied and a disagreement suddenly becomes, I'm going to report that to HR, and all the angry black
Yeah, so if I can just add to that, Samira, if we look at the Amy Cooper incident in the park, you can see how quite clearly, if people don't want to think that white privilege exists, that is a prime example. She weaponized her whiteness because she knows how a black man is treated in America. And you can hear that even the way she spoke on the phone. So that for me is a very good example of how white privilege exists and how it can be used to affect black people negatively.
Thank you. And just for those who haven't seen it, if you haven't, you really must. An African-American man was doing bird watching in Central Park, and a woman had a dog off the leash in an area where it shouldn't be, a white woman, and he politely asked to put a dog on the lead, and the next thing you know, he filmed it. She's ringing the police and reporting a black man threatening her, knowing all that could mean, as Claire pointed out. It was quite remarkable. Right, who hasn't spoken yet on this issue? So we're talking about white privilege.
I can speak. Yes. The American author, Ibram K. Kendi, says that you can't be neutral about racism. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. There's no I'm not a racist category. Mainly because racism is structurally systemic, and white people, and actually racism has been internalized by both white and non-white people. And it's done in very subtle ways. It's in some sense we accept and sometimes we have to what the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, we have to decolonize our minds. And I think Adrian mentioned this earlier, because we sometimes accept that people are arranged in a racial hierarchy. But we have to recognize that race is a social construct. It's not a biological reality. It's a social construct, and therefore it can be changed. And we have to there are enough studies actually doing genealogies of the development of racist ideas, how they came about, their linked development of capitalism, exploitation of slaves, and so on. But they have the consequences of racism is that white people and white people's ideas have become universal. Right. We call it, we use the term Eurocentrism to describe this universality of ideas from Europe. But white people's bodies are also seen as normative. Right? And we judge ourselves, even non-white people can judge themselves according to how close they are to white people. And so that we have to, that's part of the process of dismantling racism. Now, I think the other thing we need to mention...
Just before you say it, can I just put out, because there's been quite rightly a reminder, people can submit questions. We're going to take questions in about 20 minutes. Go to tinyurl.com/JCJuneForum, all one word. tinyurl.com/JCJuneForum. You can type in your name and your question, and then I can call on you to ask it for yourself. Thank you. Sorry, do finish, Patricia, and then let's...
I think, obviously, because white anti-racism, is questioning, right? I suppose it challenges what the ontological security of white people, right? And so, of course, they will, in fact, feel vulnerable. What is often termed white fragility, because suddenly we are threatening how they think, how they see themselves in relation to the rest of the world, and so on. So, but there's an interesting research that was done by an American academic called Ann Jacob. I think she was a white academic, and she looked at the effects of racism on white people in New York, and she thought it actually was devastating. It was destructive, even for white people. And she came up with what she termed the white harm reduction model, right, to show how anti-racist practices can be beneficial to white people, and help to reduce white supremacy, the effect that white supremacy has on white people, and the deep harm it has on non-white people. So it's really important to think about not just anti-racist practices as something that black people do and black people campaign for. The ideas about racism are actually quite harmful for everyone within our society, and they are not, as I said, they are not natural. They are social, and they can be transformed.
Thank you. And Adrian, finally, on white privilege and what it means in the terms of anti-racism.
I echo everything and I agree with everything that's been said. I think on a personal level, I think it's the assumptions that people make about people without knowing anything about them in a simple sense. And I think the issue is that someone's physicality is what we see, but we don't actually see the inner person. We don't know anything about the person. But when we make that assumption about the person, and within the social construct of the UK, within race, in many respects, your day-to-day experience, every time you have an interaction with somebody, people have an assumption about you. And this can manifest itself in so many different ways. For example, I'll give you just one simple example. Many years ago, I made a phone call to a family. I was staying at my girlfriend's house, and I made a phone call to the family. Now, I have a very English-sounding name, Adrian Clarke. My full name is Adrian Arundel Clarke. You can't get more English than that. And some people say I speak in a way which is very measured and very controlled, and with what you might call sometimes the home counties accent. This person I was speaking to had never seen me before. The same person came to see me, and when they saw me, they were alarmed, right? Because they hadn't associated my color with my voice. And that's when we're talking about white privilege, what we're really talking about is the personal experiences that we have as black people when people simply see our color, simply see our race, but they don't see our character. And this is very much echoed in Martin Luther King's speech about society where we're judged by the content of our character. Also, another thought I want us to consider as well is that when we look at the notion of black excellence, right? I read something the other day about black people have no room for error. And that's what's really, really important. So someone like Sidney Poitier in the 1960s always had to give an amazing performance, but also be the person to carry the burden of the black man, etc. I feel sometimes someone like Tiger Woods, to a certain extent, has this enormous pressure. Lewis Hamilton, all these people having to carry this pressure, this enormous pressure. The American baseball player, Jackie Robinson, I think had a mental breakdown after his baseball days because of the enormous pressure. And it's really extraordinary. So some white people who have enormous empathy can sometimes maybe understand this notion. But speaking as a man, right, as many books as I've read about women, I've never menstruated. I've never given childbirth. I don't have what it takes to understand what it is a woman, because I'm not a woman, as you know. And that's what I think when it comes to the notion of white privilege, is that we can never walk in the footsteps of black people. But what we can do is that we can listen, we can understand, and we can try and create a dialogue, a conversation where we open our hearts and we generate compassion and knowledge on an equal footing. If we do that, we will still have differences, but what we'll be able to do, we'll be able to move forward together and realize really that we are just one human race. And I think that's my sort of pitch on the notion of white privilege.
That's a great pitch. Thank you. Right, the one other area I want to bring up in the last 15 minutes before we open for questions, and a reminder, it's tinyurl.com/JCJuneForum, burned in your brain by now. What needs to happen now to bring about racial equality? And I think particularly all that issue we've been skirting around, which is the role of decolonising the syllabus. And I would include the whole debate about Rhodes Must Fall. I remember reporting on it a couple of years ago, and I was fascinated by why there was such an entrenched resistance to taking down a statue. So what are your thoughts about what needs to happen now, and the role particularly of things like the syllabus in bringing about racial equality? And again, I'm going to mention a book. I recently read a book called Island on Fire. I think it's only just out. It's an American book. And it's a history of the slave rebellion in Jamaica, which, of course, rather than William Wilberforce, is the key moment that helped lead to the abolition of slavery. But we were never taught it at school. 1831, the Great Slave Rebellion of Jamaica. It seems to me that those kinds of incidents, just flipping the way we teach history, would be such a simple but powerful tool as part of this issue. Who wants to go first on this? Claire, I feel that you're going to.
Okay, I can speak. I can speak from my discipline perspective, geography, and certainly, there's been almost a movement in geography to decolonize the discipline. And surprisingly, most of the work that's been done has been done by Native American scholars, from and Canadian scholars in geography. But I mean, this movement, as I said earlier in my introduction, geography was a colonial discipline. Its institutionalization was to promote and supply young men for empire. But one of the things, there are a number of things that we are trying to do in the discipline. Perhaps before I even start talking about, I'll show you how geography works in terms of the geography that was done in soon after its establishment. Right? Geography was used to make places or render places visible by Europeans. Right? So places were not known until they were discovered by Europeans, then named into being. So, for example, Victoria Falls in Zambia and Zimbabwe border, the local people called it Mosiotunwa. Right, the smoke that thunders. If you've been there, you'll know why it's so pertinent. Right? When they told Livingstone about it, David Livingstone about it, and they took him to the falls, and he named it after Queen Victoria. Right? And even now, it's really difficult to change the name, and people call it, and including myself sometimes, use that name, when in fact, we need to, and David Livingstone is seen as the person who discovered the falls. So geography has a duty there, right, to these indigenous knowledges, indigenous ideas about place visible. Right. So an aspect of the discipline, a sub-discipline is post-colonial geography, which has done, where some great work has been done on these archives, on this work, to show the role that indigenous communities played in the discipline. I think the other thing that is pertinent in my subject is the imaginative geographies we have about the world, right? And that recognizing that these are not, again, neutral, that they are very much the outcome of colonialism, such as when we divide the world into developed and underdeveloped. Third, and even now we have a much more euphemistic term, global south and global north. These are terms, again, that are linked to our colonial legacies. And we have to think about ways of dismantling these spatial divisions that exist. I think the other thing I want to say is about, colonialism and racism, as we've said earlier, is promoted Eurocentrism. And we need to think about the epistemic violence, what some people have termed it, that has occurred as a result of this. So, for example, European worldview and knowledge systems about particular things dominate. And in my subject, about the environment, about nature and our relationship with those. But what we've started to do, and I've seen, as I said, there's a lot of scholarship in North America and in Australasia, but not so much yet in Africa and other places. But we've started to look at indigenous understandings or interpretations, ontologies about nature, right? And that's very different from the one that's associated, that we know, where nature is separated from humans. And that came about, as part of the development of Western modernity. I know there's students here, so young students, I'm very careful about the terms I use. But if we think, that means really it's not about, therefore, what we're saying is recognizing that these knowledge systems exist and have value, right? And can play a role now in helping to redress some of the problems that have been created by through climate change, through our practices that have destroyed the environment. And it's not an easy thing. We're not saying we don't want European knowledge. We want to say, let's contextualize it. There's an Indian scholar called Deepak Chakrabarty who talks about provincializing Europe and provincializing European knowledge. So it's one body of knowledge that sits against other bodies of knowledge, rather than it being hegemonic.
I'm just conscious because of the limits.
Okay, I'll stop there.
What's great is you've given us a really lovely, rich example from the specialism that which is geography, which of course would translate to other disciplines. So no, thank you, I'm glad. Who wants to go next?
I'll jump in, yeah. I just think this idea about looking at the curriculum syllabuses, whether that's in secondary schools or in higher education, I think there needs to be a balance with teaching about problematic figures or problematic events from history, balance in that, okay? So, for instance, I had one of my modules I've done recently was on David Hume and his philosophies. But let's talk about the fact that David Hume wrote some quite racist things. Talk about the fact that Kant wrote some quite racist things. It doesn't mean that their philosophical positions weren't good or haven't contributed to the way that we think about the world. But actually, let's bring that into the conversation as well. When things look like they're sanitized and there have been erasures of history or cherry picking of what people have done, that presents to me a problem. And so just thinking about the English classroom, why don't we read Mary Prince's diary of being a slave? I think that would be a fantastic text to look at. There's so much in there about, the human condition, I think, and the literary value of that text as well. So I think it's about bringing voices of, making louder and amplifying the voices of Black people and marginalized groups within our curriculum as well. So it doesn't look, so our curriculums aren't so Eurocentric.
Thank you. That was so beautifully put, because you raised two issues. One is widening the range of voices. It's not about taking anyone off. It's about saying who aren't we listening to at the moment. But also the idea that people can be complex figures, whether that's Winston Churchill or John Ruskin. I made a whole program about how actually some of his ideas helped emancipate women. But he actually didn't think that was what he was trying to do. And he was also notoriously racist. but it didn't mean that there wasn't interesting, positive effects of some of his ideas. That complexity is really important, especially as I think the backlash tries to argue that people are trying to throw out entire figures. So it's very important that that isn't allowed to be claimed. Adrian and then Paulina. Or is it Paulina, then Adrian? I saw you, Paulina, looked like you were about to go for it. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I wanted to pick up on what Claire said, because it's so, and what you said, Samira, because it's those who attack the notion of decolonizing the syllabus always emphasize that it's some kind of barbaric move. We won't have Shakespeare and Milton, but we will have some unknown and not very good figures. Whereas we need to remember that what decolonizing the syllabus means is that it's not about throwing anyone out. It's about how we teach those people. It's a question of how. And as students of literature and history, we need to be alert to how they wrote about race, about gender, about sexuality. This is vital. And secondly, it's giving a wider overview of society at the time and seeing how we understand them in the context that produced them, but also what is the significance of those texts now. It's not about liking or not liking. They may be disturbing texts, but that doesn't mean that we should somehow throw them out. We need to read them, need to analyze them. And the last quick point I wanted to make is that it has to be a systemic, structural thing. It can't just be tokenism. And I've been noticing when I've been interviewing for English theses that there are attempts. So, for instance, for a few years, everybody seemed to have been reading Alice Walker's The Color Purple. This year, everybody has read Othello. But The Color Purple is about America. It's not about Britain. Othello is a book written by, yes, but it was written back when. What about the Black experience now?
Yeah, thank you. And final word to Adrian. You've got a couple of minutes, and then we've got some brilliant questions ready to be asked.
That's wonderful. Again, I agree with everything that everyone is saying. I think for me, it's about having parity. It's about mutual respect again. I just give you a sort of general. If you think about the ancient Egyptians, and we consider that ancient Egypt is a society which, the forerunner, if you like, of Greek and classical Roman society, as it were. But yet we have an image, and sometimes people forgot that Egypt's part of Africa. And then what some people do, some brutish people have done in the past, is that they've Ptolemized Egypt. And what they've done is that, they look at types of Egyptians, etc., and then negate the Nubian aspect of Egypt. And also when you think generally about civilizations, we need to understand that every culture, every society, the Indus, the Mayan, etc., all had civilizations. And this is something that really needs to be not something which is tokenistic. So we're not just talking about 1 month, Black History Month, as good as it is, right? It needs to be an integral part of what we're actually doing. I'll just give you a physical example of something which I think, if you go along to the Chelsea Flower Show, you're not going to go and see one flower, right? And you'll be rather disappointed, right? To a certain extent, our lives have been these people who've gone along to flower shows and we just see one flower all the time. Yet we know there are daffodils, we know there are all sorts of things going on. I think education should not just reflect humanity, it should reflect nature. We should be inclusive. And what we need to do as well is that we mustn't be slaves to standardization. And what I'm saying here is that what people do is that when we talk about change, people go, like that means you want the standards to slip. You're going to lower them. So it's always a conversation of negativity. Actually, what we want to do is that we want to actually include everybody so that all the standards are going to raise, you see. So I think we need to be very careful when we talk about change, is that what we're really saying is that, change is not about getting rid of things. It's about putting things in their proper context. It's about understanding in 1492, the so-called age of discovery, we know that the Chinese went to America. We know that the Vikings went there. Eric the Red, I think it was, etc. And there's all this other evidence, which is, as we know, is exploding around travels, etc. The Silk Road, all sorts of things that we can talk about. And it's about having this. And also the final thing as well is that as important as slavery is, it's certainly in terms of the African American, the African Caribbean experience, Black history isn't just about slavery, right? Slavery is obviously a very traumatic, very significant part of recent history, the last 500 years. I mean, if we talk about the Mali kingdom, the richest man that's ever lived, even richer than Jeff Bezos, the Sultan, I think, of Mali, Mansa.
Adrian, sorry, just I'm conscious of question time. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do,
So I'm getting very excited there, as you can see. I'm very passionate about this subject.
I want to be taught by you. I want to be my teacher.
Yeah, I
no, thank you. So with the questions that we've got, I'm going to call on you to ask them. And when I call on you, take a moment to turn on your camera, if you like, and turn on your mic. And actually, for those of you who've written in questions without a surname, would you mind putting in your surname? Because then, for example, I've got two Angelas. Right, I'm going to start with... Right, can I call on Sarah Milburn, please, to ask your question? And you're a school leader, aren't you? Hi, Sarah.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for the discussion so far. This is something that we've been discussing as a school and as a leadership team, and we're meeting about it tomorrow in more detail. And I just wondered how the panel might advise or some points for them to think about in terms of how we approach this as a school leadership team with our school community.
Thank you. Brilliant question. Who wants to take that? I don't think everyone can answer on everything unless we keep it very tight. But I don't know, maybe Adrian would be quite good on this as you're a secondary school teacher yourself and a leader at the school.
Yeah, I think what I would suggest is that that we mustn't feel fear. I mean, because teachers are overburdened with a lot of work, and it's another thing that they might need to do. And we mustn't look at it like that, because that's negative energy. What we need to do is embrace this opportunity and realize, as educators, this is a wonderful opportunity, almost a Willy Wonka moment, if you like, the Charlie and Chocolate Factory moment, where we can make something really amazing. And we're in the best possible position because we've got young minds in front of us. So what the leadership need to do is have emotional courage, moral courage. And I know that we're restrained as teachers by Ofsted and standards and criterions and all the rest of it, and every initiative we need to solve. So what we need to do is be positive. We need to say, look, this is something which is going to make not just our lives better, right? It's going to make the world a better place. So leaders need to have a very powerful vision. They need to want to humanize the world, really humanize the world from the heart, as well as using the intellect. That's what I would do.
Thank you. And Claire?
I think that I would advise, I think it's Sarah who make you answer the question, to not feel like you have to do a quick sort of knee-jerk reaction. Quickly, let's put up some posters of Black people and then it becomes tokenistic. It's okay to take time to think these through, to have a long-term effect. And I think, just asking, your faculty leaders, how could you, in your syllabus, as Adrian said, teachers are under a lot of pressure. I salute all the teachers. I left the classroom and I know what you're going through. But how can you, so giving teachers and giving faculties ownership of how they can address this problem, rather than just simply imposing something from above that, by the time it gets to the teacher in the classroom, it doesn't quite have the effect. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Can I call on Rishi Patel, please, to ask your question? Thank you, Sarah, for yours. Hi, Rishi. Right, I think you're still mute. I can't hear you yet. Have one more go and then we'll come back to you if necessary. Try again. No. Shall I ask your question for you? Are you happy if I ask it for you? Sorry, Rishi, because I know that you're there. Right, that's a terrific question. Do we need to overhaul the Oxford course structure to encourage more Black or disadvantaged students, such as through the use of foundation years, or or proactive affirmative action policies? And I know foundation year courses are very, very significant. Universities like Keele have been using them to encourage wider working class participation. So it's not just about issues around race. I'm guessing, this is obviously one for you, Patricia, and I don't know who else would like to talk about this, but maybe Paulina too, as you're both teaching at the university.
Yes, I do think a foundation year could help. and obviously it's been trialled in one college at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, and there are opportunities now to extend it across a similar program across the university, which I think university is trialing this year. But nevertheless, I think the key thing really is to get young people to apply to Oxford. I think there are lots of, when I look at the A levels, there's still a lot of young BME people getting good A levels from state schools who don't necessarily see Oxford as an option. And, I think, I'd like to really encourage them to apply. I think the other thing is that it's really, I think we have to also recognize that you can go to a poor state school, but still have immense ability. And I think what we are good here at Oxford is actually teaching, providing really high quality teaching to enable young people to excel. And we see that in our results, in that, state school students, outperform other students from the private sector once they've been given the opportunity. Right? So I'm also keen on targets. Actually, I think it's really important that we have to push my colleagues, to think about. I think there's sort of certain cultural constraints about what a good Oxford student, or cultural ideas about what a good Oxford student should be. Right, and somehow we have to unlearn those, and it's not necessary that someone who's well spoken, who's shy, who dresses in a particular way, and so on. We've got to really unpack that's our imaginations about what a good Oxford student should be when we're at the point of selection. So there's a lot of training to be done. But also, I think targets do work. They help to focus our mind. But more than ever, I just like to encourage more certainly Black, because I follow the A-level results, and I notice that they're more, they're going other places. They're not thinking about Oxford, and I want them to think about Oxford.
Well, there's partly an issue about predicted grades, isn't there? And often people perform better, but they've been given low predicted grades. That's a real phenomenon.
That is true, yeah, and
I know you will have thoughts on this, won't you, as a teacher and a careers leader who very much encourages students to apply to Oxford.
Oh, most definitely. That's the link with Jesus College, as you know, Samir. I mean, from my experience, some of the students have an idea that Oxford is rather like the Harry Potter films, in that you see these enormous steeples and you see this almost Gothic-like place. Now, for some people, as we know, the image is so important. And there's also this idea, will they be good enough, in terms of social capital? And for some children, particularly in the cities, etc., they don't necessarily have what you might call the soft skills. And one of the things that we know this from research, but also from anecdotal experience, is that one of the things about private education, it gives people enormous self-confidence, even if they're not really confident. They're very good at winging it. Some people make this an art form, and you see this a lot in the House of Commons. People winging things, etc.
I wonder what you could be thinking of, Adrian.
Yeah. And what is interesting about that is that, the world's a stage, and it's about trying to get young people to believe that anything is possible. And I think it's also important as well, is that when the students go up to Oxford, it's that they're incredibly nervous about the whole interview process. So one of the things I would like to see change in my experience is that if more work can be done on that, it's also if people understand that the young people in front of them have never been in that position before, and they find it terrifying to a certain extent. And also, I think another thing as well is just if we can get rid of this idea that Oxford and Cambridge are just the elite. I mean, there should be part of the educational process. They're amazing institutions, and I was very privileged to spend 2 years in Oxford. But I know that what Oxford has done to a certain extent, it's almost Disneyfied its kind of existence. And what I mean by that is you almost have to be too pure to a certain extent. And I think what Oxford always needs to become rough and ready to a certain extent. And in terms of how it promotes itself, make it more open, more accessible, so that everyday Joe, everyday persons can apply. And that makes it come through.
There's so much food for thought there. I think we could do a whole other event just on that. Pauline, did you want to come on this, or Claire?
Yes, well, I just wanted to say very briefly that it's so important what Patricia said. More Black people should apply. We really, really want you to come. And we're doing a lot, and we have been doing a lot to improve access even before the recent event. Claire recorded a fantastic access video for us last autumn discussing her experience. I remember her interview. She was talking to us about Aristophanes all those years ago. And people need to listen to alums like Claire, who will tell you that it's not a terrible experience to be in Oxford, and it offers all kinds of opportunities. And I'm afraid that Oxford has come under so much bad publicity. And as a literary scholar, I tend to read what people say in the comments section in various papers. And there seems to be a terrible backlash. How they want to destroy this or that statue. They're all sort of left-wing vandals. They're not. And if we think about what happened during the Reformation and the fact that Catholic shrines were being destroyed and the whole iconoclasm, well, this is also British history, so let's not sort of forget about it.
I want to put next two questions together, one of which I think will be asked in person, the other one I'm going to ask on their behalf. And it's Angela Jackson's question. If you're there, would you like to turn on your camera and your mic and ask your question, Angela? Hey, Angela, go for it. Is your mic on? Because we can't hear you. Right, try again. Problems with the mic. Try speaking again, Angela.
Is that not better?
Yes, go for it. Right, ask your question. Thank you.
I'll make it quick. I obviously should be reading my next book, Learning from the Germans, because I'm half German, so and I studied German and French in college. So from the German experience, maybe there are some things which can help, and it's a difficult process for the Germans, and some have made progress, others have got further to go.
Would you mind copying the question? Apologies, just because of timing.
Yeah. So the question is whether the panel would consider doing anything similar along the lines which they do in Germany, which is these very small stone memorials on the pavement.
These are memorials commemorating individual Jewish citizens and families who lived there and were deported, so they're scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
And the other question I want to add to it, it's actually from someone called Ray, who doesn't want to ask it himself. Should we still have a dedicated Black History Month? Or should it be embedded enough across the curriculum that it doesn't become a tokenistic event? And I wanted to put that together with Angela's question, because I think there's something really valuable there about how commemoration works. And sometimes it can be very visible, it can be very high profile, but actually, is it achieving what we want it to achieve? Who wants to take this one first? Who's going to volunteer? Patricia, go for it.
I think there's a symbolic element really about with respect to commemoration. We have services, if you think about it, we have remembrance services and so on. And I think the pavement idea actually would be very important symbolically. And so I'm not against it. I think they should be widespread throughout the UK. I think there are lots of other places we could draw attention to. For example, country houses. I know some work has been done on that, and you know, and about the resources that have gone into their construction. So memorialization celebrates. It's about often, statues celebrate. Memorialization really is about recognizing what the society values as important. So any attempt to memorialize the experiences of BME people within the UK, I would support. With regards to Black History Month, I think, of course, Black history, but also is part of British history. I think we've said this already. It's part of British history. And so if we were to teach British history to its full extent, we would teach Black history. Right? So that's what we need to do in the curriculum. As far as Black History Month is concerned, I think it should still be maintained because this is about public engagement, about educating the wider public who will not have gone to school after the changes are made to the curriculum. Yeah, so I'm for maintenance of both. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Any other brief thoughts on this? Claire, did you look like you were going to say something?
So I think it was Paulina.
Paulina, sorry, yes, go ahead.
Just a brief point again about looking at what we're doing here in a wider context. And I'll give a Polish example. I was living on a street named after Patrice Lumumba, who was a Congolese independence fighter and politician. And after communism had fallen, suddenly the name of Lumumba was removed from the street name because he was seen as some kind of communist and tarnished by association with that regime. So it would be important to look at what happened to monuments in post-communist countries in what we're doing here. And I absolutely endorse what Patricia said. We need a Black History Month, but we need to have a comprehensive rethinking and reform of syllabi and also all kinds of cultural institutions and educational institutions in this country.
Thank you. I want to take a next question, which is from Benjamin May. If you're there, you've got your camera. Do you want to go ahead and ask it? Thank you, Angela, for your question. Is your microphone on? Take a second. Don't worry. Right, that sounds like you might be on. Benjamin, have you found your mic? Give us a go. It was, when you pressed your camera on, it's right next to it.
Is that it? Can you hear me?
Oh, well, we can hear you now, so go for it, yes.
Great. Now we've got both. So you've got me in audio and visual. Okay, let me go back to my question so I can read it correctly. Okay, thank you. Thanks for your patience. As a white male teacher, how do we position ourselves in this discussion when my race and gender are beyond my control? And forgive me for saying, but not being represented on the panel.
Thank you. Adrian, go for it.
Yeah, I think what you do is you do your job to the best of your ability, because that's what I've been doing for all my life. Is I've been, as a Black man, in the context of your question, that's what I've been doing in terms of interacting with society, in terms of, if you like, being an active citizen. And I think you're in a very privileged position as a teacher as well. You're not just a white male. You're somebody who's actually imparting, if you like, the next generation. I think this is so important what you've said, because what you've inferred to a certain extent is that you might be a problem. And I want to encourage you, and I want to say this to you now, you are not a problem, but you're part of the solution. And what that means is that you might have to do, if you might, some self-learning, some self-awareness about the type of students in front of you and the type of information that you are. Because what we're saying here is that we're not saying that white people can't teach Black history, or that the fact that white people are teachers, that they're not able to impart this, or that a man can't comment on the experience of women, etc. So I think that's a slightly different argument from saying that, the society is racist and having an ethnocentric kind of view. I think what you ought to do is that you ought to say, this is something which I need to approach from the point of view is that, I'll give you an example. I went to Japan many years ago, and in Japan, it's common practice not to shake people's hands, but to bow. Now, my instinct was to shake their hand, but what I learned was to bow and say, "Wakarimasu ka? Konnichiwa." And what I was doing in that act was I was reaching out to my Japanese friend and saying, look, I'm not Japanese. I don't understand why you're bowing. However, because I want to be part of your experience, I'm going to bow. And I think that's what you have to do to a certain extent. Not that you should be bowing in the classroom sensibly, it's the kids will start laughing. But what you ought to be doing is understand that you mustn't see yourself, as I say, as a problem, right? Embrace this possibility of learning about, about yourself, but also about a group of people who've lived amongst you for over 1,000 years. I mean, the Windrush is recent, but they've lived. We've had black people in Britain for a very long time, and I think this is so important because that is one of the major stumbling blocks for change. Is when people take an almost sort of sense, or oh, I'm disempowered. I want to empower you, right? I'm here to help you get to the place where you want to be, and this is what today is all about. And it's about understanding that when we make changes, sometimes we have to look into ourselves and we have to take that risk, and we have to understand. But at the end of the day, what is it that we want? We want to achieve a better outcomes for everybody. And I think the best way forward to doing that is just being opening yourself to that possibility.
And of course, calling on expertise from people who do know. So that does sometimes mean if you haven't got black members of staff at school, you need to look at bringing in from outside, and also in the long term, I guess, making sure that the staff is diverse, and what could be done on that. Let me take in one more question if I can. This is from Sanj Gupta, unless I've mispronounced it. Apologies if I have. And I can see you're there. And if you want to turn on, go ahead.
Is my video moving? Because I
The
can just
video's
see
not moving, but we can hear you, which is the most important thing. So go for it.
Okay, great. My question was more about sort of what can decolonizing the syllabus look like outside of the curriculum? Because I think when I look at sort of the people I've met at Oxford, I am a Jesus alum. Paulina has taught me in the past. I think about, the scientists among us, or the social scientists among us, and those even within the humanities that didn't elect to take modules that addressed extra-European history or addressed content that wasn't about kind of the canon as we know it. So what can we do sort of both beyond the humanities and beyond the system of formal learning to promote this kind of education, this kind of awareness in the student body overall? I think it's also coming from a place of sort of getting minority students into Oxford is one thing, but I know many peers that have run up against sort of cultural tics within the system that are based on class, based on race, and find it difficult to adapt, especially initially. And so, my question is, what could this decolonization or anti-racism endeavor look like beyond the curriculum, especially when sub-students don't engage with it?
Thank you. Really well put, especially when some students don't engage with it. And I think taking that one step further, and it's true in my profession, I encounter there are people who happen to be white, but they understand multicultural living, and they have friends from, across different communities. And there are others, often in positions of extreme leadership, who just don't know any black people either, but insist that they are incredibly unbiased. So I think that's all implicit in that terrific question of Sanj's. Thank you. Who wants to go for it? Decolonising the syllabus.
I can go first. I think there are two things here. First of all, in many courses, and even in my course in Geography, what we have tried to do is to center decolonizing, create new lectures that are part of the core papers, because and to make sure and encourage that students to take them and college tutors to teach them in their particular colleges. So making some of these courses and topics as part of the core is very important. They have to be compulsory. Right? And in terms of the environment, I agree, you have to change the culture of the environment, and that will come from having more diversity in terms of staff and students, but also recognizing that those staff, staff and students from different cultural backgrounds have different needs. Right? So, one of the things I pushed for example, is to make some time ago, and I think it's quite widespread now, is to make sure that halal food is served in some college kitchens. Is to make sure that the meals are not purely sort of British, although British food has become quite varied now. To think about the activities that we also hold within college.
Can I say that was really diplomatic, what you said about British food?
Well, it's no longer. Well, it's never been totally sort of indigenous. We know that. There's, especially so. But also thinking about, what sort of activities we put on for students. And I mean, I last term, for example, sorry, in Michaelmas, we held during Black History Month, we held a workshop or a discussion, a mini conference about one of our alumnus, Norman Manley, who was a former, First Minister of Jamaica. And actually, we brought in people from the community. It was a really exciting event. I was a bit sad that there weren't that many Jesus students there because they saw it as a Black History Month event and it was for Black people. And so I suppose my task really is to try, and that of my colleagues, is to try and find ways in which we can change that culture and to provide activities that can embrace the whole college community, that are not just about British identity.
Thank you. And because into the last 5 minutes, I just wondered if the rest of the panelists would like to give their closing thoughts, give them a specific response to what I think is a really good last question. It's kind of about decolonising society, but you're outside of academic syllabus. What are your final thoughts? I don't know who wants to go first on this. You can just briefly. Or even just what your hopes are as a result of forums like this. There's clearly a desire to do something. So any closing thoughts that you have would be great. Paulina, and then
actually following on from what Patricia was saying, I think, and this is probably a controversial thing to say, given that we are in a crisis and pandemic, but it also requires more investment. And I remember a committee meeting at which Sarge was present, where we were discussing the provision of teaching for history and English at Oxford. And the post-colonial paper vanished. And it vanished not because of bad will, but because there wasn't anyone to teach it, because the person who was responsible for teaching it went on leave. So there has to be more investment from the institution, from Oxford University, but also others, to invest in positions, or when we advertise for posts, to tweak them in a particular direction. So we have several people who are working on Milton. Well, next time we appoint, let's make sure that it will be a post which will address some of the questions that we have been discussing today.
Terrific plan. Thank you, Paulina. Adrian.
Yes, I think going back to what I say in the beginning about life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. Yeah. It's about learning to dance in the rain. And I think the thing is that's the stage I think that we're at the moment, is that we can see the stormy clouds, we can see obviously the post-COVID situation, and to a certain extent Brexit. There's a lot of issues around at the moment, and which are forcing us as a society, and obviously the situation as far as the environment as well. But I would like to think that as a species, as human beings, that we see this as an opportunity where we can not just come together, but we can make meaningful changes in our day-to-day lives with our interactions with people, where we consider the other, where we don't see the other as something which is, less, which we don't see the other as something which is less important, whether that be gender, whether that be class, etc. And I think certainly in the context of race, we need to really fully understand it is a social construct. As human beings, right, we have this similar DNA in terms of the genetical makeup as people. And I'm hoping that the awful murder of George Floyd has, pricked the conscience of the world into meaningful action. Let's hope that's what comes out of this. And the conversation, the final point, the conversation is ongoing. And some mistakes will be made, but we need to forgive ourselves, like Benjamin May mentioned being a white male teacher. He's a white male teacher, and that's not his fault. And that's not something for him to think is a negative thing, right? This is a wonderful opportunity for us as people to work together and to see the best and seek out the best in us and be the best that we can be. Let's make the world a better place. And I mean that not to be cheesy, but with wholehearted compassion. That's what I want to see coming out of this. I want to see more love, more consideration, more kindness, and create a better world. That's what I would like to see.
Claire, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just I think I'm always going to bring it back to the classroom and education. That's my passion. I just think just having the resilience to see these conversations through to the very end, rather than kind of being caught up in the moment. Everything's quite sensational at the moment, but actually seeing it through to the end and not being afraid to talk about race, because I think, you know, just going back to education, if a student has special education needs, no one would think twice about, you know, using funds to help that student. If girls are underperforming, no one would think twice about doing something to meet those students' needs. Race is no different from those conversations. So it's okay to invest. It's okay to meet the needs of students from the Black community and say, do you know what, we're going to do something to improve their prospects for the future. So just not being afraid to talk about race and you know, not feeling we're going to say things that are wrong. And as a Black person, I need to be careful not to sort of stonewall when as of a naive or well-intentioned question offends me. I need to be persistent with the conversation. Equally, a white person shouldn't shut down or deflect when I'm sharing my experiences. It's about ongoing dialogue. It's not gonna be solved tomorrow, but I think that persistence and that fearlessness and that courage to say, do you know what, we're going to make changes.
Yeah, well, that is just a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much. Terrific questions. We didn't get to ask all of them, but I think we covered all the areas that were being raised in the question. So thanks for everyone who's been participating. Thank you so much to all of those who agreed to speak, to Patricia, to Adrian, to Claire, and to Paulina. And just so you know that Jesus College is planning to do more forums like this. So jesus.ox.ac.uk if you want to give any feedback on this event and how you want them done in future. And I just would like to say it's been really nice to be part of this conversation and to hear all the questions asked and all the answers given, and to wish everyone the best. It's a really weird time to be in higher education with the pandemic. My son has just had his first year at university disrupted. My daughter's had her A-levels cancelled. So I'm really sympathetic to the dilemma you're in, but keep up the amazing work. And as Claire said, it's not like there's an end point. It's ongoing. So thank you all. And I'm going to say goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Samira.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.